Our New Testament reading is from the Gospel according to Matthew, beginning at chapter 22, verse 1. This is found on page 24 of the New Testament in your pew Bible. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I saw an article a couple of weeks ago intimating that Emma Watson, who is best known for playing Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter movies, is dating Prince Harry. I am not ashamed to admit I got pretty excited thinking about this little bit of news. Watson is not only a fine actress, but also was recently appointed the UN Women's Goodwill Ambassador. I listened to her inaugural speech online, and I was incredibly impressed. She's a very bright young woman with a lot to offer. And then there's Prince Harry. Through all their ups and downs, I have a soft spot in my heart for the British royal family. Emma could be just the tonic they need. And if by chance there were to be a royal wedding, well, maybe I could manage to get up ridiculously early in the morning to watch it live, just like I did in the summer of 1981 to watch the wedding of Prince Charles and Diana. Sadly, royal weddings don't always turn out the way we hope they might. And that thing about Emma and Harry? Only a rumor, sadly. But I have to admit, the story Jesus tells today takes royal weddings to a new low. This is just awful. There's a preaching guru whose work I love and who I regularly turn to for inspiration and help when a passage is particularly difficult. He writes regular, encouraging epistles to people like me that begin, "Dear partner in preaching." His article on this passage, it's called "Preaching an Ugly Parable." Not one preacher I know who is preaching this text today is happy about it. We have a king, and he invites many guests to his son's wedding. In the ancient world, a wedding was a two-part affair. First, you had the betrothal, the signing of the paperwork between families, smoothing out all the details, dowry, etc. And then you had the bride being brought to her husband's home, where they would establish their new family together. This was the part that was usually celebrated with a great feast. And if the feast were given by a king, well, you can just imagine this would be the most desirable ticket in town. The invited wedding guests are most likely very important people. Imagine being one of those VIPs. Imagine if the Emma and Harry thing were real and you were invited to their wedding banquet. Buckingham Palace. Very exciting. It would be quite the deal. So the king sends out his slaves to remind all the guests that today's the day. Come to the feast. Inexplicably, irrationally, almost impossibly, the invited guests don't come. But the king is undeterred. He wants the guests to come to the feast. So he sends his slaves again, and the invited guests again turn down the invitation. They say things like, I really need to get my car washed. Or, gee, I think I need to get an early start on my taxes. Their excuses are pathetic, insulting. Their level of disrespect for the king is astonishing. This is an inexplicable rejection of the invitation of a very important person to experience what would surely be lavish hospitality and generosity. This alone would be bad enough, but to top it off, some of the invited guests actually torture and kill the slaves who've been sent to remind them of the party to which they've been invited. What? So the king retaliates, like kings do. No sooner are the pictures of the people who have been killed on the TV and the internet than the bombing raids are dispatched. You know how it works. And not only are the killers killed, but usually their entire town is destroyed too, just like in this parable, burned to the ground. Same as it ever was. But this is a parable from Jesus, the storyteller, so we are going to be like those proverbial kids on Christmas morning, digging through the proverbial pile of manure until we find our proverbial pony. It's in there somewhere. The king decides to send more slaves this time to bring the people off the streets. Everyone is invited. The good, the bad, without distinction. The bag lady, the church lady, the guy selling fish and chips from a cart, the gang member, the insurance representative, the streetwalker. No VIPs here. The people. All the people. And this is where the parable, for just a few moments, starts to sound like Jesus, like the Jesus we know. People will come from east and west and north and south to take their places at the feast in the kingdom of God. Yes, everyone is invited. Everyone is welcome. Sounds like Jesus. It's all going so well all of a sudden. Is this it? Have we found our pony? Then we begin to wonder, was Jesus having an off day? Was he really ticked off at somebody? It gets very, very dark. Suddenly, one of these just invited people off the streets catches the attention of the king, and not in a good way. You, hey you, the king addresses the guy. In the Gospel of Matthew, when someone calls you friend, it's not actually friendly. It's more like Buster or pal, said with a sort of a menacing tone. Hey pal, how did you get in here wearing that? Where is your wedding robe? And before he can say, hey, I was just selling fish and chips, he is hogtied, ejected, thrown somewhere where it is very, very dark and very, very sad and painful and full of weeping and moaning. Where is our pony? By which I mean, where is our blessing? It's got to be here somewhere. When in doubt or when backed into a dreadful corner, it always helps to look at the context. And what we find if we go back and read the chapter prior to this chapter is very informative. Jesus is ticked off at someone. It turns out we have wandered right in the middle of a pretty terrible family feud. All through chapter 21, Jesus is having run-ins with the authorities, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders of the people, the Pharisees, in other words, the religious elites. The beginning of the chapter tells of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, in which the people are hailing him as the Son of David, the Messiah. Jesus then goes into the temple where he turns over the tables of the moneylenders, and it's all downhill from there. The religious authorities challenge his authority, and then Jesus starts telling parables. They're all parables with targets. This is the third of 3 that he tells. The targets are those who are getting it wrong. The targets are those who have turned faith and practice into a contest with impossible demands and subsequently innocent victims. Jesus says, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, and you are making it a den of robbers." Matthew tells us, when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. Jesus tells this parable. "Try comparing the kingdom of heaven to this," he starts out. We have a king, and he invites many guests to his son's wedding. The king in the parable, in fact, looks a lot like King Herod. You remember him. He was known to invite people and then force them to attend. People didn't necessarily want to go to Herod's parties because he threw the kind of parties where people sometimes ended up beheaded. You've heard that story, probably. The invited guests don't come. In fact, the Greek says they were not willing to come, which, once we understand the allusion and who exactly is in Jesus' sights, is completely understandable. That they kill the messengers is a sign that there may be a rebellion stewing somewhere. One scholar says flatly, this is a people who do not desire their king's lordship. The king retaliates, like the kings of this world always do, like Herod always did. He lashes out with violence that punishes the guilty and innocent alike. Then he sends his slaves to invite the regular people. And once we recognize the nature of this king, we start to wonder, is it generosity that prompts him to commandeer guests? Or is it a desire not to be embarrassed by an empty banqueting hall? Of course, many of those invited are hungry enough for a decent meal that they go. And then the king sees someone who was not properly dressed. You know the rest. The seeming generosity of the wedding banquet has cruel and arbitrary requirements attached to it. Some have described the kingdom of heaven this way, Jesus is telling us. Some have described it as having a violent, angry king who says, in essence, accept my generous gift of grace because I love you so much, and if you don't, I will throw you into the outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus is mirroring back to the religious authorities the vision of God's reign they are offering people. It is ugly, and Jesus is having none of it. What Jesus is having, and what you and I are offered, is an invitation to the table. And what Jesus is banking on is that the experience of God's freely given love and welcome table will change us, soften us, deepen us, open us up to an encounter with the living God. The kingdom of heaven is like a feast. That at least is true. A splendid feast which we do not prepare ourselves, but which we are served, and to which all are invited and all are welcome, and where we do not have to worry about proper attire. In our baptism, we have put on Christ. Christ is enough attire for us. This is attire enough. We are enough. We are welcome. This is our pony. This is our blessing. Grace, love, and welcome. This is all God's doing, not ours. And Jesus has strong words for anyone who tells us otherwise. Thanks be to God. Amen.